this talk. This is our March of talks. We have a lot of talks scheduled this month, as you all know. Partly because we had the Sherwood this year, and also because we had to reschedule a weather canceled event. So it's great to see such a good turnout, and keep your eye on the space for future talks and news coming out as well. Today's speaker, though, that we'll review is David Wilson. David Wilson was born in Ireland from County Antrim in the north. In fact, I learned last night that he is from the peninsula of alienating, which was the subject of a book by our own colleague Don Kingston. Of course, what hasn't been the subject of a book by Don Kingston. Professor Wilson studied as an undergraduate at the University of York in England before immigrating to Canada and, of course, to Queens, where he completed his master's degree and PhD under the direction of George Rawlick, as a colleague of Jane Harrington, and as I've just discovered, as a colleague of sorts of Daniel Wolfe, who was an undergraduate at the same time. So it was quite a generation of Queens people. His academic posts took him from Canada back to Ireland, to the other Queens period, I believe, and then back to Canada. He had an interlude as a radio presenter for CBC Ideas, the radio series. And he eventually joined the Department of History at the University of Toronto, and then quickly found his most significant institutional home, I think it's fair to say, at the Celtic Studies program of St. Michael's College. And many of the Canadians in the room will know that for the last decade he has been the general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Canadian Biography. He is the author of, by my count, correct me if I'm wrong, at least a dozen books. The first being a study of Tom Paine and William Cobbett in transatlantic radical politics. This appeared in 1988. I'm not going to go through all of them, except to mention that the last book appeared just last year and is entitled Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries and the Secret Police. In between, the books range widely over subjects such as the Irish diaspora in Canada, empire and race, revolutionary movements, politics of religion, state security. It's an output that's diverse in subject matter and also in genre, so it's impossible to quickly characterize, but those of you who have read David Wilson will know that he is a superb writer, and I'm just going to quote what one reviewer said of his most recent book. Canadian Spy Story is brilliant historical scholarship. The profundity of its argument deliberately concealed by its gripping narrative. Wilson waits until the end to reflect on larger questions of civil liberty versus national security that pervade the entire story. It's a masterstroke of storytelling. What's your appetite for today's talk, State Security, Civil Liberty, the Origins of the Canadian Secret Police, which emerges from this book, I believe. So David Wilson is one of the country's leading historians, a product of and a friend to Queens. Please join me in welcoming his talk.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. I can't tell you how great it is to be back at Queen's after all this time. It's quite a moving experience for me. I'd like to thank Jeff and Amitabh for inviting me and for their hospitality, and Bronwyn Jakes for all the arrangements that you've made, Bronwyn. Thank you very much. So, state security, civil liberty, and the origins of the Canadian Secret Police. I'm going to talk for maybe 45 minutes or so, and then I look forward to an extended Q&A in which you should feel free to ask questions not only about the talk, but also, if you like, about the activities of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography or any other historical or historiographical issues that you would like to raise. So I'm going to begin with two apparently unrelated events on March the 17th, St. Patrick's Day, 1858. We begin in Dublin, where 6 men meet at the lodgings of James Stevens, a seedily attired personage. He was described as a seedily attired personage, long-haired and of somewhat bohemian cut, and part of a new phenomenon in Europe, the professional revolutionary. Together, the six men swore an oath of allegiance to the Irish Republic, now virtually established. And they pledged to their very utmost at every risk, quoting it out, to their very utmost at every risk while life lasts, to defend its independence and integrity. Dublin, St. Patrick's Day. Meanwhile, in Toronto that same day, a young man named Matthew Sheedy put on his black satin vest, embroidered with shamrocks, joined several hundred of his fellow Irish Catholics in the city's St. Patrick's Day parade, and walked straight into a full-scale riot between Catholics and Orange men, and walked straight into his own death after a knife was struck upwards into his groin. Two apparently unrelated events. The meeting in Dublin triggered a trajectory that is well known to historians. The formation of the Irish Republican Brotherhood as a secret society, planning to rise up in revolution when Britain was embroiled in a foreign war. The rapid emergence in the United States of its counterpart, the Fenian Brotherhood. The repression of the movement in Ireland. The resulting split in the United States between those Fenians who wanted to carry on the struggle in Ireland and those who believed that the best way of revitalizing the revolutionary movement was to strike the British Empire at its most vulnerable place, Canada. Those events are reasonably well known. The murder of Matthew Sheedy in Toronto set off another chain of events that is much less well known. After the riot, some of the city's Irish Catholics established the Hibernian Benevolent Society. It was designed to defend their community, a minority community in Toronto, against Orange attacks. Within a year, the Hibernian Benevolent Society became the nucleus of the Fenian Brotherhood in Toronto, and subsequently throughout Canada. Its founding members included a group of young men who would go on to become some of the leading revolutionaries, Irish revolutionaries, in the Atlantic world. There was the 18-year-old Murta Moriarty, who would lead an abortive Irish rising in County Kerry in 1867, and who would be denounced by an Irish Catholic bishop in one of the most famous or notorious Irish sermons of the 19th century. Hell is not hot enough and eternity is not long enough to punish such miscreants. There was Edward Condon, also 18 years old, who became a Fenian commander in Manchester, and whose speech, after being found guilty in the murder of a policeman, ended in words that became a rallying cry for Fenians throughout the world. God save Ireland. It was turned into a song that became Ireland's unofficial national anthem and remained so until the official one in 1922, the Soldier's Song. Also there in Toronto, at that parade in 1858, as a member of the Hibernian Benevolent Society, was William Mackey Lomani, 17 years old, who would organise a guerrilla campaign in County Cork, and who would blow himself up in 1884 while trying to plant a bomb under London Bridge. As one Irish-American nationalist commented in 1879, I quote, "Toronto stands, par excellence, the foremost city of America for the number of true patriots it has produced during the past 20 years, in proportion to its Irish population." The foremost city of America for the number of patriots it's produced during the past 20 years in proportion to its Irish population. And no wonder, if you are going to be a Fenian in loyalist Orange Toronto, and by extension in loyalist Orange Canada, you are likely to be a very serious Fenian indeed. At the head of the Hibernian Benevolent Society and the head centre of the Fenian Brotherhood in Canada was a cooper and tavern keeper from County Cork, 26-year-old Michael Murphy. Small man, of slight build, sharp features, dark beard, according to one description. According to one of his enemies, a charismatic figure with much mother wit and great sturdiness of character. A cooper, a tavern keeper. Most of these Fenians were in fact artisans from that sort of, not the working classes, although there were some there, not the middle classes, although there were some there as well, but an artisan base. Artisans, shopkeepers, tradesmen, that kind of world. Michael Murphy came out of that world. He not only had great mother wit and sturdiness of character, he had a remarkable propensity for hyperbole. The Fenians routinely promised imminent revolution. They routinely inflated their numbers to keep up morale, but few took it to Michael Murphy's level. At a Fenian convention in Philadelphia in 1865, we find him declaring that 100,000 Irish Canadians were prepared to support an invasion of Canada. During St. Patrick's Day celebrations in Toronto, we find him claiming that 20,000 Irish Canadians would gladly shed their blood in the cause of Irish freedom. And casually doubling the number the following year, 40,000 Irish Canadians would gladly shed their blood. 1 million Irish lives, he once said, would be worth paying as the price of national liberation. Rhetoric about rivers of blood ran through much of Fenian rhetoric and Irish-Canadian Fenian rhetoric in the mid-19th century, and would subsequently be adopted, embraced by revolutionaries such as Padraig Pearse, the leader of the Easter Rising of 1916. Watching and listening to Michael Murphy's speeches were members of the newly formed Canadian Secret Police Force. Its leader in Canada West was Gilbert McMicken, a Scottish immigrant whom John A. Macdonald described as a shrewd, cool, and determined man who won't easily lose his head. McMicken's counterpart in Canada East was Frederick William Ermatinger, the son of a fur trader and an Ojibwe woman, who had extensive experience in regular police work. McMicken reported to Macdonald. Macdonald micromanaged the operations. Ermatinger reported to Georges-Étienne Cartier, whose papers have been destroyed in a fire. Consequently, we know much more about secret police operations in Ontario than we do about Quebec, which is unfortunate because there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to indicate that Quebec actually outpaced Ontario as the decade of the 1860s progressed. But we have quite a lot to work with anyway. The spine of a study such as this is 3,000 letters that can be found about the Fenians in the Macdonald papers. 3,000 letters. They consist of reports from detectives in the field to McMicken, upwards to Macdonald himself, and then back down again, back down the chain again. It is an historian's goldmine. Subsequent Canadian historians may have treated the Fenians as bad actors in a comic opera. Macdonald evidently did not. The secret policemen who were monitoring Murphy's speeches were relatively new to the job. The force had been established in the winter of 1864-65, not in response to the Fenians who were planning to attack Canada. The Fenians weren't even on their radar, so to speak, but to Southern Confederates who were planning to use Canada as a base to attack the northern states during the Civil War. That was the genesis of the secret police force. It was cobbled together in a hurry. It drew mainly on regular policemen who were released from their duties. And a miserable time they had of it. The initial recruits lacked training, they were poorly paid, and they were frequently subjected to threats and attacks from the community. when one of Gilbert McMicken's detectives, a man by the name of James Allen, sought alternative employment with the Toronto police force, he was rejected on the grounds that members of the Secret Service were, quote, so degraded in vice and drunkenness, unquote, that they were not fit to be hired. In the early years, half the members of McMicken's force were accused of intemperance, misconduct, and assault. And the detectives even began informing on each other, in their blood, so to speak. Ironically, Allen had a clean record, but he was found guilty by association. So they had a terrible reputation. And when the Civil War ended in the spring of 1865, the force was gradually being disbanded. Its raison d'etre had disappeared, only to be resuscitated in the fall of 1865 as the stories began to circulate in the United States that the Fenians, or some of them, were serious about attacking Canada. So now most of the early recruits are not continued. They're replaced, and the onus now is placed on a small group of trusted men with the ability to pass themselves off as Irish Catholics who want to join the Brotherhood. So there's a new kind of secret policeman that's needed. Their mission was twofold: to discover the plans of the Fenians in the United States, and also to learn more about their supporters in Canada. And they needed to do that in Canada because the Fenians had set up their own secret service. This is one of the many things that surprised me as I began the research on this subject. The Fenians had their own secret service, and they actually called it that in Canada. They called themselves the Irish Republican Army, and they called their secret service the Secret Service. They sent sleeper agents into Canada to study the topography, to look at the railroad system and ways of hobbling it, to report on how the Welland Canal could be destroyed, to identify other strategic vulnerabilities. Fenian emissaries from the United States liaised with local supporters in Canada. They raised more recruits. They plotted ways of synchronizing the invasion with domestic disruption. So they drew up plans to cut telegraph wires, to blow up bridges, to burn down buildings, to suborn Irish soldiers in British regiments, to spike guns, to take political leaders hostage. John A. Macdonald and D'Arcy McGee were high up on the list of hostages they intended to take. Now, we're not talking about mass Irish-Canadian support here. We're not talking about Michael Murphy's fictitious 100,000 men preparing to support an invasion. We're talking about small groups of Irish-Canadian revolutionaries working with their Irish-American counterparts. Because taken by themselves, the Fenians in Canada were never more than a minority of Irish Canadians, or Irish Catholic Canadians. My guess, and it can't be much more than that, because it's difficult actually to find good criteria to define Fenianism. We can get into that in the Q&A, but my guess is that around a quarter to a third of Irish Catholic immigrants sympathized with the Fenian objective of using revolutionary means to establish an independent Irish republic. A quarter to a third. I think that's a reasonable guess. But many of those Fenians, especially in Toronto, repudiated the strategy of achieving this end by attacking Canada. They were against that. They wanted to continue the focus to remain on Ireland. So when it comes to pro-invasion Irish revolutionaries in Canada, we're looking at very small numbers indeed. It's important to keep that in mind. Alone, they could achieve little or nothing. But in conjunction with the much more powerful Irish-American movement, they had the ability to punch far beyond their weight. On paper, the Canadians had a number of sources upon which they could draw to crack open the Fenian Brotherhood. They had their own detectives in American cities. That's an interesting, another actually surprising aspect of the research that I found. Canadian detectives were operating freely in American cities, sometimes with the cooperation of American authorities. They were supplemented by an informer network run out of the British consulate in New York, by a Nova Scotia man, the British consul, Edward Archibald. He ran his own spy network out of the British consulate. The Irish police had their own man in New York as well. But despite all this, they were unable to penetrate the Fenian leadership. And for those of you who know the historiography, there's an image of the Fenians that they were very, very easy to crack. This was not the case up to and including 1866. This was not the case. Most of the informers who approached Edward Archibald, the British consul, Nova Scotia man in New York, most of the informers who approached him were unreliable, as he knew. And the Canadian and Irish detectives in the United States were picking up bar talk and rumours. I mean, they were hanging around Irish pubs, you know, and initially they stuck out like sore thumbs. You know, who is this person asking these questions? Does he have a job? He doesn't seem to be employed, but he's got money to buy alcohol. What's going on here? So they had to adjust their operations, but even when they did, they were only picking up bar talk and they were picking up rumours. And because the Fenian Brotherhood itself was feeding exaggerations to its rank and file to keep up morale, the detectives were picking up exaggerations. Irish independence and liberty is all you can get out of them, one exasperated detective said. Irish independence and liberty is all you can get out of them. The spy masters were fully aware of these problems. They were actually quite sophisticated given the limited means at their disposal in their assessment of intelligence. Although as we'll see, those sources were limited and their initial attempts to crack open the Fenian Brotherhood were unsuccessful. How do you get to the top of the organization? This was the key. How do you, if you want to get beyond bar talk and rumors, how do you get to the top? One plan only presents itself to me, and that is this. McMicken told MacDonald. One plan only presents itself to me, and that is this. That one or two clever women, underlined, whose absolute virtue stands questioned by the censorious, might be obtained by address could get some of the susceptible members of the Fenian Senate into their toils, and thus, as Delilah with Samson, possess themselves of their secrets. Unquote. To assist this patriotic initiative, McMicken travelled to Baltimore, quote, in order to see a woman of this stamp, unquote. He added helpfully that he knew another woman, quote, just suited for such an operation. But MacDonald never replied, and there's no evidence that McMicken's strategy was ever carried out. Copulating for Canada, it seems, is carrying things one step too far. So, the Fenian Brotherhood was actually very good at keeping secrets in 1865 and 1866, contrary to received opinion. Partly because they made it clear that informers would be shot, and mainly because there were so many rumours flying around that it was virtually impossible to ascertain which ones, if any, were true. This you can carry forward into the more recent times. The former Taoiseach, or Prime Minister of Ireland, Garret FitzGerald, was in Toronto a few years ago giving a talk, and there was a dinner party afterwards, and we got chatting. And we talked about negotiations for the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, which was the kind of precursor of the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. And Garret FitzGerald said that the Irish found it very, very difficult to read the British because the British didn't say anything. And the British found it very, very difficult to read the Irish because the Irish said so much. And something very similar was going on, similar dynamic was going on in the 1860s. When one wing of the Fenian Brotherhood organised an expedition to take Campobello Island in New Brunswick in April of 1866, and again, this is something that's completely misread in the historiography. It's one of those things where stories wind up repeating themselves, a syndrome you've probably encountered before. One secondary source repeats another secondary source, repeats another secondary source, and it becomes gospel truth. The standard interpretation in Canadian historiography is that the authorities were tipped off by an informer called Red Jim McDermott, that they knew an invasion of New Brunswick was imminent, and they gathered their defences and defeated it that way. None of that is true. None of that is true. The more deeply you look into it. The British and Canadian authorities only learned about the operation to take Campobello in the pages of the New York World newspaper, and even then it seemed too crazy to believe. Nor did the Canadian secret police know about the Fenian incursion into the Niagara Peninsula in June of 1866, until it was right upon them. But Micken, I can gather nothing from any quarter at present of anything being done, indication of a movement of any kind, May 17th, 1866, unless we take the absence of bluster and the unusual quiet everywhere as an indication. 2 weeks later, 1,000 Fenians under the leadership of John O'Neill were in Fort Erie. So it's a massive intelligence failure. On the other hand, the secret police acquired a fair amount of information about Fenians within Canada. One of the detectives, a man named Patrick Nolan, was the brother of a leading Toronto Fenian. I wonder about the family dynamics here, because when you betray your own brother, clearly there is serious sibling rivalry going on. And he used that connection to provide McMicken with detailed information, which all in the MacDonald papers. You get the names, the numbers, the meeting places of the city's Fenians, who donates for Fenian bonds, fundraising, how much they give, the works. In Montreal, the sources are more opaque, but we know that Thomas D'Arcy McGee and Georges-Etienne Cartier ran their own spy networks. And it's possible that the founder of the Fenian Brotherhood in Montreal, a man named Francis Bird of McNamee, it's possible that he was actually working with the government. Possible, but impossible to prove. I'd be very happy to address that further in the Q&A. In the towns and villages of Canada, the secret police identified scores of suspects. So all this meant that the Canadian authorities had a pretty good idea about the leading Fenians in the country, but they knew relatively little about the rank and file. The rank and file tended to be its classic sort of conservative ideology when it comes to radical movements. The rank and file tended to be treated, dismissed as dupes, who'd been dismissed, who'd been misled by demagogues. Sort of standard interpretation. And that's actually one reason why members of the rank and file were not arrested, as we'll see. They were seen as dupes, not as instigators. So the failure of 1866, failure of the intelligence plans of secret police to uncover the invasion plans, prompted the government to adopt a longer-range strategy to penetrate the leadership. So that we move into a different world now. And one of the things that they do is to set up a fake Fenian cell, or Fenian circle, in Missouri. And it's headed by the top detective in the force, Charles Clark. And he does this under the name of Cornelius O'Sullivan, sets up his own Fenian cell in Missouri, and uses that as a base to visit New York regularly, where he befriends the city's leading Fenians. And he works his way to the top of the organization. So using Secret Service money, for example, he buys a pony, supposedly from Missouri, as a gift for the 11-year-old son of the president of the Fenian Brotherhood, William Roberts. Charles Clark is one of the most fascinating and indeed egregious characters that I encountered in my research on this subject. He's an Irish-speaking Catholic who converted to Protestantism and joined the Orange Order. As far as the secret police was concerned, this was gold. Like an Irish Catholic who speaks Irish, really important because the Fenians tended to communicate with each other in the Irish language to make sure that they were insulating themselves from spies. And he knows his way around Mass, he knows his way around Catholic religious rituals, and he's reliable. He's a member of the Orange Order. He attends Mass and Sunday dinner regularly with the Roberts family. He's featured in the Irish American newspaper. This is a pro-invasion Fenian newspaper, He's featured as a model Fenian. He's presented with a Fenian uniform for his services to the cause. Shortly afterwards, though, everything comes crashing down in a sex scandal. Charles Clark, or Cornelius O'Sullivan, as he's passing himself off as, is married with a daughter in Toronto. And while his wife Anne lies ill in bed in Toronto, Charles Clark is having an affair in New York with a friend of his niece, a young woman by the name of Miss Clapp. I'm not making this up, that really was her name. Kind of like her first name, but there are quite a few Miss Clapps out there, in fact. He abandons her. He may have got her pregnant. It's hard to say. He certainly promised her marriage. There's strong evidence to suggest that. He abandons her. She tracks him down through Clark's niece. She discovers his true identity, and she goes straight to Fenian headquarters with the information. She's going to get revenge. Fortunately for Clark, he was actually back in Canada at the time. But that effectively ends his usefulness as a spy in North America. But it wasn't quite the end of the story for Charles Clark. After reports emanating from Toronto of an apparent Fenian plot to assassinate Queen Victoria, he's seconded to the newly formed and short-lived Secret Service Department in Britain. The Fenian uniform he was given is shipped across the Atlantic in a diplomatic bag to help him work his way into Fenian circles in Britain and Ireland. But that's another story. It didn't end happily. We could perhaps discuss it in the Q&A, or maybe you'll invite me back for another talk on the assassination attempt on Queen Victoria. But it's a really interesting story. And one of the people that Charles Clark brought into the organisation, because this is what you can do if you're trusted, you get to the top of the organisation, you can recommend people to join, who are of course fellow detectives. And one of them was another Irishman by the name of William Montgomery, who went under the name of William McMichael. And he continued the work, but of course William Montgomery came under suspicion himself because he'd been brought into the organisation by Charles Clark, who had been outed. And other detectives ran. They just thought, let's get out of here as fast as we can. William Montgomery didn't. Even though there were implicit threats, he was told, there are people around here who are going to smell gunpowder when they least expect it. And he was definitely suspected himself. But he played the card of, basically, that bastard Charles Clark. He fooled you just as he fooled me. I resent him. To coin a more recent quotation, I hate him passionately, along those lines. So William Montgomery continues the work. And by 1868, he's given the honour of carrying the Fenian flag from the Battle of Ridgeway, the Fenian victory in the Niagara Peninsula. He's given the honour of carrying the Fenian flag from the Battle of Ridgeway during the major Fenian parade of that year in Philadelphia. So we have a Canadian detective as the flag bearer of a Fenian parade. William Montgomery sends regular reports back home. He provides McMicken with detailed information about Fenian finances, arms supplies, and military preparations. Unbeknownst to Montgomery, the Adjutant General of the Irish Republican Army was also working for the British and the Canadians. Calling himself Henri Le Caron and pretending to be French, he was actually an Englishman named Thomas Billis Beach. There are varying accounts of his French accent, most of which seems to be like an Essex accent that was somewhat Frenchified. To American ears, I suppose it sounded strange and therefore French. I don't know. Under the name of Henri Le Caron, Thomas Billis Beach had fought with John O'Neill during the Civil War, and he began what turned out to be a long career as an informer in 1867. And as a close friend and confidant of O'Neill, the Fenian leader, Beach was well placed to keep McMicken and MacDonald informed about Fenian battle plans. And again, the sources are fascinating because you get reports of him distributing Fenian arms close to the Canadian border by day, and then secretly sending details of their location, right down to the maps and the barns and the farms, to McMicken by night. So when O'Neill launches his second raid into Canada in May of 1870, in what was supposed to be a surprise attack, the government was on full alert. The result was a humiliating failure for the Fenians that set back the cause of revolutionary Irish-American nationalism by at least a decade. So for the Fenians, a serious, serious blow. For the Canadian Secret Service. It's one of its greatest intelligence achievements. But I want to shift the angle of vision now for the rest of this talk and focus on not so much the intelligence operations in the United States, important as they were, critically important as they were, but the importance of intelligence operations within Canada. Because in doing so, in taking security measures within Canada, the government opens up fundamental questions about the relationship between order and liberty in the country. And for some contemporaries, the very existence of the secret police force and its use of informers ran counter to British traditions and was to be rejected as such. It was something that was associated with European despotism rather than British constitutional liberty. Yeah, you'd expect the Austro-Hungarian Empire to do that. Yeah, you'd expect the French to do that. You'd expect Prussia to do that, but not us, we're British. There was that kind of view. And some of the loudest protests against the secret police initially came from corrupt local politicians whose illegal cross-border operations during the Civil War were exposed by the secret police. So St. Catharines was one of the hubs of illegal cross-border activities. One detective in St. Catharines was knocked down, beaten and kicked by the men he was investigating. And a local magistrate justified the attack by stating in court that, quote, the detective was a spy, and every spy ought to be well kicked, unquote. Perhaps not coincidentally, the magistrate was at the heart of a smuggling ring. In Ireland, of course, informers had long been among the most reviled and despised people in the country. And they also functioned as convenient scapegoats for the failure of revolutionary movements. There's a book in that, if someone wishes to tackle it. As a young radical in Ireland, D'Arcy McGee joined in the derision. I do not so much denounce them, he said of spies and informers. Their profession is their punishment. They live on the earth not so much as men among men, but as fiends, whose element is falsehood and whose trade is perjury. That was D'Arcy McGee as a revolutionary in 1848. By the mid-1860s, as a liberal conservative cabinet minister, he had a rather different view. Canada and Britain, he wrote, have never known an enemy so subtle, so irrational, so hard to trace, and therefore so difficult to combat. To overcome that difficulty, he continued, Irish Canadians must forget, quote, the hereditary Irish fear of the nickname informer, and recognize that the suspension of habeas corpus was a regrettable but necessary measure to safeguard the country from external attack and internal subversion. Civil liberties from this perspective must be suspended in the interests of state security. And indeed, habeas corpus would be suspended 3 times between 1866 and 1870, with most of the arrests occurring after McGee's assassination in 1868. Drawing on secret police reports, John A. MacDonald believed that the man charged with the murder, a Tipperary man, Patrick James Whalen, was part of a conspiracy involving a core group of Fenians from Quebec, Montreal, and Ottawa. That was the information he received. Although secret police information indicated that McGee's assassination was not, repeat, not an authorized Fenian operation out of headquarters in New York, one report from a usually reliable source, in fact an extremely reliable source, maintained that Whelan was more than simply a rogue Fenian, that he had been a Canadian delegate to a Fenian convention in Cleveland and had been in contact with Fenian headquarters in New York. Indeed, there was much circumstantial evidence connecting Whelan with Fenianism, none of which was used in court, partly because it did not meet the standards of proof required in legal proceedings, the difference between intelligence and evidence, partly because informers and spies needed to remain undercover, and partly because on the one occasion in the trial that the prosecution tried to link Whelan with the Fenian Brotherhood, the judge immediately shut the argument down. This is not about politics, this is about an individual case. We're not having politics here. Although everyone, of course, knew it was really about politics. The arrests under the suspension of habeas corpus initially focused on Whelan's closest friends and associates, not surprisingly. But they were soon expanded to include Fenian leaders in Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Guelph, which was a centre of Fenian operations in Ontario. It quickly became apparent that the government was trying not only to pry open a possible conspiracy behind McGill's assassination, but to disrupt the Fenian organisation in Canada. I'd just like to say a few words about the operation of the suspension of habeas corpus and its consequences, because some of the people who were arrested after the assassination were released within days or weeks. But those who were closely connected with Whelan, or who were regarded as Fenian leaders, were kept in jail for several months. And the personal costs were high, sometimes very high indeed. One of them, Patrick Buckley, cracked under the pressure. There were reports that he had, quote, become insane since his incarceration. Another, Patrick Doody, contracted TB in prison and died in January of 1869. At his funeral, he was described as, quote, the first martyr in Canada to Ireland's rights and liberties. The first martyr in Canada to Ireland's rights and liberties. Other prisoners lost their businesses, still others were unable to work their farms. I am a farmer, one of them wrote to the Governor-General. I am a farmer, and your Excellency will conceive the irreparable loss I have already sustained by not being permitted to attend to the farm when sowing should be done. Such losses may seem trifling to men of state, but they are important to a poor man. More generally, the arrests sent waves of fear through radical Irish nationalists in Canada. The universal themes are, said John Lawrence Power O'Hanley in Ottawa, the universal themes are, hang 99 out of every 100 of the bloody Irish papists, and it is pretty safe to conclude that the right one will be of the number. String them up and try them afterwards, unquote. Now, such feelings in the context of the suspension of habeas corpus, such feelings are not surprising. But it should also be pointed out that O'Hanley, who was hardly a supporter of the Conservative Party, he was an Ottawa Liberal, O'Hanley praised MacDonald for fighting against these universal themes. MacDonald, he wrote, had, quote, acted with moderation and deserved great commendation for the manner in which he has throughout resisted the pressure to bear on him on the side of persecution. And I'd like to continue this, to pursue this point, because it's another thing that surprised me in the course of my research. I really wasn't quite sure what to expect with MacDonald, in truth. But immediately after the suspension of habeas corpus in 1866, he issued a circular to magistrates, warning them against, quote, hasty and ill-judged arrests of suspected Fenians, and insisting that all arrests under the suspension of habeas corpus be sent to his office for appraisal. As MacDonald told a leading Irish Catholic journalist, he wrote that circular, quote, for the purpose of reassuring the Roman Catholics who were a great deal bullied in several parts of Canada, especially among the magistrates. And he actually acted on this further. In September of 1866, he upgrades a judge in St. Catherine's who argued that people should be arrested, quote, on mere suspicion of Fenianism. Now, this is a country of law and order, MacDonald reminded the judge, and we cannot go beyond the law. The Habeas Corpus Suspension Act gave no authority to the government or the magistrates of the country to proceed without informations on oath. All that it did was to prevent any applications for bail or habeas corpus after first commitment. The consequence of allowing illiterate magistrates to arrest any man whom they chose to suspect, and that would be in rural districts, every Roman Catholic, would be to drive all that class out of the country, to ruin many a respectable family by forcing them to sacrifice their property, and to swell the ranks of the Fenian organization in the United States by every man who has been obliged to leave the province. That same message was getting down to the detectives in the field, much to their frustration. They knew of Fenian supporters and sympathizers who were saying things like, you know, Canadian militiamen who fought the Fenians ought to be hanged for fighting Irishmen, and they wanted to arrest them, but the Crown attorney, under MacDonald's directions, refused to do that. No one was going to be arrested on mere suspicion, quote unquote. And in the aftermath of McGee's assassination, the suspension of habeas corpus was used in a highly selective manner. The numbers vary. I mean, I often read that there are 50 or 60. I've been able to track 25 after extensive research. There may be more, probably are. But the numbers were fairly limited because the secret police had laid the ground. They knew the identity of most of the local leaders. So the idea of the government was to decapitate the Fenian movement rather than to cut swathes through it. By November of 1868, the government thought it had succeeded. Fenianism is dead in the United States, commented the Mayo-born Crown Attorney, James O'Reilly. The prompt action of our government in making arrests last spring has effectively stamped it out in this country. He should have remembered that the Fenians chose the phoenix as their symbol for a reason. His appraisal was part of a long line of premature obituaries for the Fenian Brotherhood, as he would discover 2 years later when the Fenians once again crossed the border. So, in conclusion, concluding comments, I want to turn to the broader question here, because the Canadian government was facing a dilemma that is not entirely unrecognizable in our own day. How could it isolate and defeat internal and external revolutionaries without alienating the moderate majority in their ethno-religious group? So how can you isolate, how can you defeat internal revolutionaries within an ethno-religious group without alienating the majority of people within that ethno-religious group? There is no doubt that civil liberties were violated. Habeas corpus was suspended. Mail was intercepted. Secret agents were used to infiltrate Fenian circles, although there's no evidence that any of them acted as agents provocateurs. At the same time, the government was facing revolutionaries who planned 4 invasions in 5 years and actually attempted 2 of them. We know what happened 100 years later, when the FLQ kidnapped British Trade Commissioner James Cross and Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte. When asked how far he would go, Pierre Elliott Trudeau famously, or infamously, depending on your point of view, replied, "Just watch me," and followed up with the War Measures Act that resulted in the detention of nearly 500 people. So how far did MacDonald go? Not as far as might be expected, and for at least 3 reasons. First, he didn't want to trigger an anti-Catholic backlash, which would have resulted in escalating ethno-religious tensions, which would have fueled extremism on both sides. So to prevent this from happening, he trod carefully and he publicly downplayed, deliberately downplayed, the internal threat posed by Fenianism. Quote, "The Fenian organization has gone to a very large and dangerous extent in Canada," he confided to one of his correspondents in 1868. "The Fenian organization has gone to a very large and dangerous extent in Canada, although I said as little about it as possible." By the way, you have some of them in Stratford. "There is no intention of arresting people on suspicion. On the contrary, I endeavour as much as possible to keep matters quiet." Fascinating, and his public silence speaks volumes about his private concerns. And the contrast with those modern politicians who want to energize their base by stoking ethnic or racial fears could not be more striking. Secondly, he didn't want to lose the Irish Catholic vote by taking a hard line against the Fenians. MacDonald had formed close links with Bishop Lynch of Toronto and Bishop Horn of Kingston. He won the support of the conservative Irish Catholic newspaper editor, James Moylan. He cultivated the Irish Catholic vote as well as the Orange vote. He knew that draconian measures would drive moderate Irish Catholics into the arms of the reformers, and he did not want to undermine all his previous efforts to bring Irish Catholics into the conservative fold. So there was that consideration. Thirdly, as his letter to the St. Catherine's judge attests, MacDonald realised that severe measures against the Fenians in Canada would only strengthen the organisation in the United States. It would increase the likelihood of more raids in future. So this realisation not only prompted him to tread softly with suspected Fenians, but also to commute the death sentences given to those Fenians who had been captured after the 1866 raids, and to release all of them before they had served a quarter of their prison terms. Now I want to contrast this, because I think it's a very striking contrast, with MacDonald's response to the Northwest resistance of 1855, and particularly to the death sentences handed out to the 11 Plains Cree at the Battleford Assizes after the Frog Lake massacre. While MacDonald had deliberately downplayed the extent to which Fenianism had taken hold in Canada, he deliberately exaggerated the extent to which the Plains Cree were implicated in the Northwest resistance. Quote, "We have certainly made it assume large proportions in the public eye," he told Lord Lansdowne, Governor General. "This has been done, however, for our own purposes, and I think wisely done." And while MacDonald had commuted the death sentences given to Fenian invaders in 1866, he did no such thing with the Plains Cree at Battleford. Exaggerating the Fenian presence in Canada and executing the Fenian prisoners would have been dangerous, would have been counterproductive. Exaggerating the threat posed by the Plains Cree, on the other hand, would open the way to breaking the last vestiges of indigenous autonomy in the wake of white settlement. And letting the executions of the Plains Cree go ahead would drive the point home. "The executions," he remarked to Indian Commissioner Edgar Dewdney, "ought to convince the red man that the white man governs." So the common factor here is pragmatism, right? It's pragmatism in the service of specific goals. Pragmatism is the key to understanding MacDonald's position towards the Fenians, although his insistence that this is a country of law and order should not be discounted either, even though, as we've seen, law and order could be stretched or contracted in ways that met political objectives. In the 1860s, at any rate, he refused to ride the wave of populist anti-Catholic anger that threatened to engulf the country. He rejected the notion that if you scratched a Catholic, you'd find a Fenian. He took measures that he believed were necessary to safeguard the country while attempting to ensure the extraordinary powers of the government were not abused. And in thinking about sort of wider implications of this, I'm not sure, because everything is so bound by circumstances and specificities. It's hard to make meaningful generalizations from this. But the relationship between civil liberty and state security is quite clearly an issue that's going to haunt us for many years to come. We have the rise of populist and religious extremism, we have the politics of polarization, we have the continuing threats of domestic terrorism, international terrorism. Depending on the level of fear, whether it's based on reasonably accurate assessments of unfolding events, or exaggerated in the service of power and profit by demagogic politicians with supportive media ecosystems, depending on the level of fear, there are likely to be calls for draconian security measures. On the one side, there'll be those who, taking a principled stand, wish to uphold the rule of law and preserve civil liberties under all circumstances. On the other will be those who insist that there can be no real freedom without security, and will seek refuge in a form of protective authoritarianism. But in the specific circumstances of the 1860s, at least, the Canadian government, when countering revolutionary extremism within an immigrant group, attempted to steer a middle course between the imperatives of liberty and the demands of security. It did not do so out of the kindness of its heart. But that attempt is nevertheless worth keeping in mind in the changing circumstances that we face and the challenges that lie ahead. Thank you very much.
Fascinating talk. We obviously have to practice the speaker here, so I'll allow Professor Wilson to field his own questions, but if you could just identify yourself before you ask your question.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. My name's Sam Challen. I'm a first-year master's student here in the department. I have what might be a very basic question, but I'd appreciate if you could try to answer it. What were the plans of the Fenians in the long term with regards to Canada? Like, had they succeeded at Ridgeway or elsewhere, what would have been their next step, and how was that supposed to lead to Ireland's liberation from British rule?
Thank you, Sam. That's not only a basic question, it's a very good question, so thanks for asking it. I think it's seriously misunderstood by previous historians of the subject, who have argued that basically what the Fenians wanted to do was to exchange Canada for Ireland. This is even in saying it, you just think, how ridiculous is that? And then the Fenians are regarded as buffoons and naive idiots. It was actually much more sophisticated than that. And beware, a long answer could be coming up here. So the dominant assumption behind the Fenian Brotherhood had been, you have to wait until Britain's at war. England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity, was the mantra. But war wasn't forthcoming. The French kept letting the Irish down by pulling back from wars with Britain. But there was a possibility of provoking a war between the United States and Britain. And there were great opportunities here, they believed. In 1861, during the Civil War and the Trent crisis, the British had brought 10,000 soldiers over to Canada. 10,000 in the winter to protect Canada against a possible American invasion. So the thinking behind the Fenian Brotherhood was, if with American acquiescence, we can hold Canada, or part of Canada, for a while, a number of things are going to fall into place. We will be a magnet for disaffected Irish Americans throughout the United States who will flock to join us. What we need to do is hold part of Canada for a week, and then the momentum will gather. The British government will be incensed by this, and incensed by America's failure to intervene. This will, Anglo-American relations were already at a low ebb after the Civil War because of Britain's tacit support for the Confederacy. And New York newspapers had been calling for war with Britain, in fact, during and immediately after the Civil War. This could tip the scales. And so now you would have Britain and the United States embroiled in war. British troops would cross over, and this would leave a vacuum in Ireland. At the same time as Irish Catholics in Ireland would be inspired and exhilarated by the victories, even if it's just one victory and you hold, that would be enough to galvanise the revolutionary movement in Ireland. And that will set in motion a revolutionary situation in Ireland. Once war begins in North America, the Americans are ultimately going to be victorious because they're stronger. Within Canada, French Canadians are going to remain neutral because they're fellow Catholics trapped in a British Protestant empire. Irish Catholics are either going to support us or remain neutral because why would they love British Protestant empire? All we've got to deal with really are Orange Protestants, and we can, quote, isolate and cut them to pieces. That was actually in the war plan, so that's the exact phrase. So that was the thinking. And I mean, they got a lot of it wrong, as we know. The Americans apparently told them that they would, quote, acknowledge accomplished facts. They may or may not have said that, but the Fenians believed that. They believed that William Seward and Andrew Johnson had told them that. So that was one assumption. Americans are going to look the other way. So that initially, Secondly, that assumption was wrong. Secondly, they're wrong about French Canadians and Irish Catholics. Most Irish Catholics would not have been neutral. They would have fought with the militia, even while they hated the Orange militia, but I think they would have done that. They were right, though, about inspiring folks back home. Because, again, full of surprises, the Irish Nation newspaper was a moderate, constitutional Irish nationalist newspaper. The week before, Ridgway writes a scathing editorial about the Fenians in the United States and their ridiculous plans to invade Canada. The week after Ridgway, they write an ecstatic editorial. This is the first time since the Battle of Castlebar in 1798 that Irish forces in the field have beaten the Redcoats. If that's what moderate Irish nationalists thought, if that's how they responded, imagine how revolutionaries would have responded. So they were right about that. But they were wrong in their other assumptions. So I think one of the things we have to do is get ourselves into their minds, cut ourselves free from hindsight and see what they viewed as being reasonable prospects of success. I should also say as well that we can talk about these strategic elements, and they're more important in 1866 than they've become later, because it was clear after 1866 that the Americans were not going to look the other way. In fact, they intervened. New Brunswick, they intervened at Ridgway to stop more people from coming in. That was clear. But there was also something I don't think we can underestimate, and that was a very powerful emotional undercurrent to this. It was, to put it crudely and simply, a desire for revenge after the famine, because you have a situation where 1 million Irish people have died of hunger and disease, and another 1 million have emigrated, and a population of 8 million. The Fenians draw many of their ranks from famine migrants, and we can get into discussions about Britain's culpability in the famine. There's a whole debate about that, but for our purposes, that's totally irrelevant. What matters is they believed Britain deliberately let the Irish starve. And so there was an incredible degree of anger, bitterness, and resentment among many, possibly most Irish Americans. And the Fenians could feed on that, and did feed on that. And ultimately, I think by 1870, it had become, we want revenge, and this is the only way we can get it. So I think that helps to explain the drive, the relentless drive. I think the Fenians kept, McGee's quotation is really interesting. They're so irrational, he says. Well, I think, in a sense, that's meant as a put-down by McGee. But I think irrationality is very much a part of this, because it's an emotional drive for revenge. And when the servant girls, the detectives are reporting about servant girls giving part of their wages to the Fenian Brotherhood and so on, talking about how they're being duped. They weren't being duped. I mean, they were doing what little they could to right what they viewed as a terrible historical wrong. So I think that aspect of it really needs to be brought out. And I just say one last thing about that. Historians can search for all kinds of explanations about what drove the Fenian Brotherhood. But sometimes you just actually have to see and read what people are actually doing and saying, and take it seriously. It's a great question. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks.
Yes.
So, thank
So
you.
your name is?
Oh, yes. My name is Sean.
Sure.
I'm in the final stretches of my PhD here. And I have a number of questions, but I'll save those for our lunch.
Sure,
later.
okay.
But I wanted to return to these clever women you
Yes.
discussed, and sort of the idea of moving beyond bar talk and rumors.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on what role in either the police surveillance or the Fenian organization women actually played.
Yeah.
It seemed like the Canadian police recognized an opportunity to infiltrate through the use or exploitation of women, or sort of the feminine ideas of surveillance. I'm wondering if you can expand on that.
Sean, it's a great question. You'll note that there were only 4 women who were mentioned in this talk. There were 2 clever women. There was Miss Clark and Queen Victoria. Right, that's it. It's the Fenian Brotherhood, of course, and there is a Fenian sisterhood in the United States. Now, there's a very interesting debate that goes on at the Fenian Convention in Cleveland in 1867. This is a pro-invasion wing of the Fenians. There's a debate about whether women should be allowed to join the Fenian Brotherhood. And the argument the wind is no. Women should not be allowed because women talk too much. They cannot be trusted. They will become informers. This from an organisation that was already by this stage riddled with male informers. There was a Fenian sisterhood in the United States, but there's no trace of a Fenian sisterhood in Canada. I mean, we do know that there were, if you like, literal Fenian sisters. I know that the sisters of some Fenian men worked as emissaries. They worked as couriers. So they didn't. So, for example, a Fenian cell in Toronto had communications with Fenian Circle in Buffalo, and they couldn't use regular post for communications. So Mary Harnett, who was the sister of a leading Toronto Fenian, was a courier. So this is one of the ways in which they operated. The Canadian, stick with the Fenians for a moment, I only have, because I looked long and hard for the involvement of women in the course of this research. And this is one of the things where there wasn't really a surprise, so they're invisible, except in one case, and that is the Irish-Canadian newspaper in 1871, 1872, I'll give you the reference over lunch if you like, ran a series of articles by an Irish girl from Quebec. Now, she had been inspired, she was, by Mary O'Donovan Rossa. She was the wife of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, a leading Irish revolutionary who would later organise a dynamite campaign in Britain in the 1880s. He was in jail in Britain, and Mary O'Donovan Rossa came through Canada on a speaking tour. It was a very unusual speaking tour because she would read poems by Tennyson, you know, and she would read Shakespeare, she would read The Charge of the Light Brigade, this kind of thing. But behind the scenes, she was liaising with Fenians. And an Irish girl whose identity I've not been able to discover was inspired, may have met Mary O'Donovan Rossa, but was certainly inspired by her. And she wrote a series of articles in the Irish American newspaper espousing the cause of the revolutionary movement, hammering the men, and actually using what we would now rightly regard as racist language in doing so. So the men are behaving like squaws, as she put it. They're carrying the heavy loads of men, when eventually carrying the loads themselves. She advocated a boycott of men who were not sufficiently patriotic. And her main theme was actually getting prisoners in Canada released and prisoners in Ireland and Britain released. And she was an ultra. She was clearly an ultra. And the last we hear of her, I think it was in Christmas of 1871 or 72, I can't remember the exact year now. And she combines this article wishing everyone peace, love, and generosity, and kindness at Christmas, with a blood-curdling call to hammer the Brits and get them out of Ireland. So, oh, and one other thing. There was one woman who offered her services as an informer. And she went down, and these services were accepted. And she went down to Buffalo because one of her school, she was an elderly woman. I was able to actually track her down through circumstantial evidence and census data. And one of her former schoolmates, I think it was Sisters of St. Joseph in Toronto, had married someone who was a Fenian in Buffalo. So she went down to visit her old friend and get information, but didn't get anything. And then she went down to the States and she met Fenians, but she was actually not giving, by this time, she wasn't giving valuable information, because by this time you had Rudolph Fitzpatrick, who was he's a quartermaster of the Fenians, who was a spy. You had Oliver Caron, you had William Montgomery. By this time, the Canadians and the British were getting really good information. They didn't need someone to report on speeches, which is what she was doing, so they didn't carry on. But they would have done in Ireland, they did. In Ireland, one of the major informers was a woman named Edith Johnson, who may actually have been a double agent for the Fenians, which is another interesting. This is one of the really crazy things about doing this research. You're dealing with lots of pseudonyms, and you're dealing with deceptions and double deceptions. Lots to talk about over lunch. Actually. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. After you first, and then at the back, please. Yes.
Okay. I'm Chelsea. I'm a first-year MA student in the department as well. I read an article that positioned the the Métis rebellion in the 1870s or 1880s, sorry, as kind of like a transatlantic event, and it talked about how newspapers across the Atlantic covered the rebellion and the execution of Louis Braille. And part of that article talked about how in Ireland, a lot of nationalist newspapers like Freeman's Journal covered it as this kind of like religious and ethnic-based event, and they kind of propped up Louis Braille as like a Catholic victim of, the Protestant British Empire. And so is there any of that in the 1860s, in this kind of similar time that the Red River Resistance is happening and the Fenian raids are happening?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I haven't actually looked into Irish responses to the Red River Resistance of 1870, so I'll do that. But it certainly would not surprise me if it was viewed in the same way. What I have looked at, and this is a classic example of the speaker now changing the question. To answer a completely different question. What I have looked at is links between the Fenians and the Métis in 1870, 71. Because it was an attempted Fenian raid. I mean, it was a fiasco at this point. John O'Neill did not have the authorization of the Fenian Brotherhood to do this. It was a freelance operation. But one of the things that was very interesting is how the Fenians in Buffalo and Rochester had identified Manitoba as the weakest link in the British Empire, and if they could break that link, the entire west of the continent could become part of the Empire of Liberty. Again, they had very racist attitudes towards the Métis, and a newspaper reporter goes up from the Irish American newspaper on a mission to sound out Métis sentiment, and reports back that most of them are actually white; they're not savages, which is really okay. But and even the savages are prepared to support us. Go on to one letter. So you have a lot of racism within this, but the Métis could be useful allies from this Fenian perspective. And there was indeed a Fenian who was an ally of Louis Riel in 1870. But Riel split from him, and so they actually did have a link there, but the logistics of getting there were just too challenging. And after the repeated defeats that they had in 66 and 70, the Fenian leadership was just not going to take that on board. A very interesting question. Thanks very much, Chelsea. There's a question right at the back. Sorry.
Thanks for this. My name is Edward. I'm a first-year PhD student. My question concerns the Fenians themselves, and you sort of touched on this a bit, but I'd like to go back to it. Yeah. So two aspects. The first is, who were the members of the Fenians? Like, are you able to break it down by things like occupation, age, average age, and how many women were involved? The other is those who supported the Fenians otherwise. This goes for both, I guess, Ireland and Canada. We get the sense that there were quite a few people in the general population. You mentioned perhaps a quarter to a third, but what role did intellectuals play?
Right. Okay. Thanks very much. Very good questions. I'll try and be brief. I did in-depth research on these very questions by first of all using the file cards from a previous historian who worked in this area, Peter Toner, very generously gave me file cards on several hundred Fenians that he'd identified. Then I supplemented that with real or suspected Fenians from Secret Service reports, supplemented that with papers of the Fenians in New York who were corresponding with Canadian Fenians, some of whom were passing themselves off as loyalists and candidates and vehemently denying any connection with Fenianism, while in correspondence with Fenian headquarters. Very, very interesting. So I wound up with over 1,000 names, and I was able to get this down to 200 people I could identify through the censuses. And okay, it's not very statistically sophisticated analysis because sources, you're dependent on extant sources. But the results are so striking, I think we can override those questions. Almost all, vast majority, two-thirds plus, were from the middling strata of society. People with leisure as well, income and leisure. If you look at photographs of Fenians, I've got some in my book, they're very well dressed, they're some of the best for this. They're far removed from the caricatures of the Fenians. You get working class people, yes. You also get lawyers. If you like the intellectual stratum, you get lawyers and engineers and doctors who are among the Fenians, who function as the leaders. The age, okay, so first of all, percentages. 97% of the identified Fenians were men. 97%. 96% were Irish Catholics. 80% were immigrants, Irish Catholic male immigrants. So you get that sort of profile from the group. The more general question about the penumbra, if you like, that's really difficult to get at, other than readership levels. So, for example, when the Irish Canadian newspaper begins to take off and is a Fenian newspaper in all but name, what's its readership like? And how does that readership compare to the percentage of Irish Catholic males in the population? And then you start getting a sense of this, because not everyone who reads the Irish Canadian is going to be a Fenian, but they're likely to sympathise with Fenian ideas. Most of them probably will. That kind of thing. Or the St. Patrick's Society in Montreal. You could do some really interesting work on this by figuring out who the Fenians are. You can get good information on the Fenians. And who do they bring in? And then who do the people they brought in bring in? And then you can get it, and you can actually see over the course of, because the minutes are very good, you can actually see over the course of 3 years how the Fenians took over the St. Patrick's Society of Montreal. But it wasn't taken over necessarily by hardcore Fenians, but by Fenian sympathisers. So it's sources like this that lead me to believe that within this movement, as with so many other revolutionary movements, there's a wider degree of support, which will fluctuate according to situational pressures and circumstances. I think that's what we're looking at here. Amitabh, you have a question too. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you, David. Fascinating talk. I loved the North American circuit of revolutionary extremism and intelligence operations. And now I have become curious about wider context and wider connections. The Fenians elsewhere and Irish revolutionaries elsewhere, even in Australia there were chapters of Fenians. So is there any evidence of this larger occurrences of bodies of Fenians elsewhere, conversations between them and exchanges between them that you can find from your research in Canada? The extension of that question is, this is also the time when you have revolutionary wars and revolutionary extremism elsewhere in the empire. In India, for example, you have revolutionary reactions against British presence picking up, and one journalist writes that we are seeing the emergence of a war between those who wear hats and those who wear turbans. So is there any evidence of a kind of an anti-imperial conversation between Irish revolutionaries and others? We know there is much later, but is there any in the mid-19th century?
Yeah.
And the final part of the question is, what about intelligence operations that are transoceanic or transatlantic?
Let me begin with the last part. Yes, there's a lot of evidence for transoceanic, there's a lot of evidence for transatlantic intelligence operations, absolutely. Oceanic, not so much. I've not found it at any rate. But then again, I've been focusing on the Atlantic, so I wouldn't rule it out. there are a lot of questions here within that broader question. The Young Ireland movement of the 1840s was very much a transnational movement with a correspondence that you can trace. There's some good work by Cian McMahon on this, on the global nature, global character of Irish radicalism, revolutionary nationalism in the 1840s and 1850s. And you know, it definitely feeds into Fenianism. To take those 6 men who met at James Stevens' lodgings, I think 2 of them had been to Australia and 2 had been to the United States, so 2 had stayed in Ireland. So they're a microcosm of exactly the kind of global Irish nationalism that you're mentioning. I didn't find any correspondence among Fenians outside the transatlantic world. So I didn't find correspondence to Australia and New Zealand and back. I'd have to go to Australian and New Zealand sources, though, to track that down, which would be an interesting project. But newspaper reports, oh yes, I mean, they are reporting on what's going on. There's definitely a global nationalist newspaper diaspora, absolutely. There's a lot of evidence for that. On anti-imperialism, it's an interesting mixture of racist attitudes that the Fenians share with most white settlers, and indeed a fair amount of racism in Ireland as well, among all ethno-religious groups. There's an interesting mixture of that and the sense of a common anti-imperialist struggle. You do get that. So, for example, to give you a sense of the ambivalence, in the Irish Canadian newspaper edited by Patrick Boyle, you know, some very racist anti-black remarks are made about Darcy McGee, for example, who was supposed to have, quote, Negroid features, unquote, you know. But that's combined with an outpouring of abuse at the British government for what happened in Morant Bay in Jamaica, and long quotations from John Bright's parliamentary speech and John Stuart Mill's parliamentary speeches. This is the true face of British imperialism, so you get that. When it comes to India, I found nothing from the 1860s, but interestingly I did for the 1850s and the Indian resistance, so-called Indian mutiny, what used to be called that. Darcy McGee, who was by this time moving into his liberal phase, wrote a series of articles condemning the British government and drawing on the inspiration of Edmund Burke versus Warren Hastings from the 18th century. So you do get that. I haven't found any engagement of the Fenians with what was going on in India at that time.
I just remember the Young India movement, which was influenced by the Young Ireland movement.
Yeah. More work's been done on links, something we were discussing briefly last night. More work's been done now on links between the Irish revolutionaries between 1919 and 21 during the War of Independence and Indian nationalists. A lot of that's been done. And that's a growing field now in Irish studies. If you're may have taxed your patience.
I want to ask more about the McDonald's strategy.
Sure.
It kind of shows again how useless intelligence can be, right? Because of course the politics of the matter has to be constrained by the public things, not the secret things of them. But to what extent is his strategy developed in correspondence with other governments, particularly the American and the British? Did the British encourage this kind of stance, or were they pushing in the other direction? Or, there must have been a lot of.
There was, yeah. There was. We find actually MacDonald sending intelligence information to William Seward. This is a very interesting aspect of the whole story. The degree of cooperation that emerged between the Canadian and American authorities, as a triangular relationship as well, because Britain's becoming a part of this. So one of the issues becomes, okay, we've got money like our own frontier. We know where all the arms are. We think we know when the attack's going to take place. In fact, O'Neill brings a surprise on everyone. So there's some scrambling to be done. We think we know this. What are we going to do? Are we going to let this invasion go ahead and hammer the Fenians hard so that will be the end of all Fenian attacks on Canada? or are we going to ask the Americans to take the intelligence that we have and stop it at its source? And they're debating this. MacDonald actually moves both ways. Initially, he says, let them come in and we'll hammer them. And then, under the influence of the colonial secretary and the foreign secretary, no, you can't do that because it could get out of hand, and you'd be blamed. The Americans will immediately blame you for letting this happen. They weren't expecting a full-scale invasion, but they thought the Fenians could do a lot of damage to border towns in raids. So in the end, they decided that they would work with the Americans to try and stop this from actually happening in the first place. The Americans were very reluctant, though, to get involved in this, particularly in 1866. We just go back a little bit. The first sign of this is the attempt to take Campbell Island, part of New Brunswick. And what happens here is when information comes through, finally, and it's not hard to get. The information only really comes through when we see that the Fenians are gathering in Portland, Maine, and they're heading north. They're coming by train towards Campobello. Then there are cables to the American government, and nobody wants to touch it because first of all, the Americans have always been saying to the Fenians, don't worry, they want the Irish vote, and they either accurately or inaccurately associated with support for Fenianism. So they're saying, well, don't worry, we won't intervene, we'll leave you to it. This seems to be their basic message. Well, while, at the very same time, and I've got good evidence for this, talking to Frederick Bruce, the British ambassador, saying, don't worry, we will stop anything from happening. We'll let the Fenians blow steam as much as they like. We don't believe they're actually going to attempt an invasion, but if they do, we will stop them. And the British are trying to figure out if the Americans are sincere about this. Are they being played or are they not being played? And Frederick Bruce says, you're not being played. This is actually their view, and he was accurate about this. The Americans didn't want, the American cabinet ministers moved this like it was like a hot potato. I don't want to be assumed taking responsibility, so I'm going to pass it on to the Secretary of the Treasury. I'm going to pass it on to the Secretary of the Navy. And it was just one after another until Gideon Wells, the Secretary of the Navy, says, enough of this, I'm taking responsibility. We're intercepting the weapons, we're not letting them get to the Fenians. So you get this kind of thing, but also at a more local level. When you look at the detectives, the Canadian detectives in the field, they strike a deal with the New York Police Force and its detective division. The New York Police Force won't stand in their way, will let them operate in New York, but in return, they want Canadian secret policemen to tell them about American counterfeiting operations in Canada, because that was a major source of criminal activity. Americans would come to Canada and set up their own counterfeiting operation. And so you've got that. And in fact, we also find when Canadian detectives are trying to crack open the Fenians around wealth, they pose as American detectives who are trying to break open counterfeiting circles in Canada. So there's a lot of this toing and froing that goes on. Another surprise here. On the other, one counter to that, but there were also, of course, quite a lot of Fenians in American police forces, including quite high up. So this had to be played very, very carefully. You find detectives saying, they're identifying policemen in Chicago and Buffalo and New York who are pro-Fenian, but don't have to do with that. So it's a real game of cat and mouse.
Well, answers to the question were as fascinating as the talk time's come to. Thank you for the last time.
Thanks very much. Great to see so many people out here, and the rest of your term go brilliant.